What is more difficult to do in the sport of boxing, 8-division world champion or 50-0? And obviously the two fighters that I'm going to be comparing in today's video are Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather. Obviously two legends. Their names are always closely tied together because they had the biggest fight in the history of boxing, the highest gate, the highest pay-per-view sales in the sport. So it's understandable that, we're talking Pacquiao versus Floyd in terms of their resumes. Historically, Pacquiao just got inducted to the Hall of Fame. Floyd was inducted a few years back. And now that they're both Hall of Famers, I think it's, fair to kind of compare and see what, accolades are more important. Obviously it's all subjective, but you got to look at it. 50-0 isn't easy to do, but I also feel like for Floyd, that's not what's impressive about, what he's done in his career. I think Floyd's so impressive because of, the separation he created from his peers and, beating multiple world champions. Floyd's beaten the most world champions out of any fighter in the sport of boxing, and that's a fact. So that's more impressive than 50-0, in my opinion. I don't think 50-0 is that impressive, but I think it's more so about who he beat. Because a lot of fighters, we know nowadays people blame Floyd because he, obviously went undefeated. So all the younger fighters now think that they can go undefeated. And then you have a guy like Pacquiao. He even said it in his Hall of Fame speech when I was there. And he said, I never fought for a record. So it's just like, what do you value more? I think if you're talking about like greatness, in terms of daring to be great, I think Pacquiao's your guy. But if you're talking about just skills to pay the bills, the best of all time, you got Floyd Mayweather. I think that on paper, Floyd's the best fighter ever. But if you look at the intangibles and the stuff you can't really see on paper, you got to go with Pacquiao because, Pacquiao really wanted the big fights. He never said, I don't want to fight this guy. Imagine fighting, or signing a contract to fight Errol Spence Jr. and then getting your Dennis Ugas as a replacement. He really wanted to fight Errol Spence Jr. at the age of like 42. I don't think people really understand how crazy that is. Do you think a guy like Floyd Mayweather would have taken a risk and signed a contract to fight Errol Spence Jr. when, he was still a top guy at 147? I don't know if Floyd would have done that, but that was something that Manny was willing to do, and it's not just because, Manny needs the money or whatever the case may be, because like, why would you just fight Errol Spence? Go fight Conor McGregor. You know what I mean? So Pacquiao was never one of those guys to shy away from a big and risky fight, but you could argue, Floyd, everybody always talks about how he kind of cherry picked his opponents, and I think there's a level of truth to that, but it's also about being intelligent in the sport of boxing. You want to gain every advantage that you can in the sport, and anyone who knows the dirty business of boxing and how boxing really works behind the scenes, you guys know that a fight is never really even. So I feel like Floyd Mayweather always had leverage, against any other fighter that he fought. I think it went from Oscar De La Hoya. That was the only time that Floyd was really the B side. After that fight, he was always that A side. He always got what he wanted. You talk about Maidana with the gloves. You talk about missing weight. He gets his way no matter what. That's how Floyd operated because he was, the A side. That's the reality of boxing. If you're not the A side, then you kind of just have to do whatever the A side does say. If you're the B side, you don't get to say anything to Floyd, and that's how he operated. But with Pacquiao, he was the A side a lot too. But if you look at the contracts, there were no rehydration clause, there were no catch weights. Manny, said, let's make a fight happen. Whoever it is, give him to me. That's how Pacquiao was. But Floyd obviously, beats Pacquiao 9 out of 10 times because it's styles. I don't think it's fair to say, oh, because Floyd beat Pacquiao, that automatically makes him a greater fighter. Because, like, at the end of the day, Floyd Mayweather wasn't able to knock out Pacquiao, but Marquez did. Does that mean, Marquez is better than Floyd? No, it doesn't. But, like, head-to-head, Marquez and Floyd fought, and Floyd outclassed him. It's like styles make fights at the end of the day, and I think, Pacquiao obviously being a more offensive fighter, Floyd being the defensive fighter. I think, we all know when there's a good counter puncher versus, a big, just regular and aggressive puncher. I just think that the boxer is going to win. It's a styles thing. It's not like to say that Floyd's better at what he does than than Pacquiao is at what he does. Floyd isn't necessarily a better fighter. He's a better defensive fighter, but he's not as good offensively as Pacquiao is. So it's just like that style, whatever you really enjoy watching more, whatever you value more. If you think an aggressor is more important, then you're going to appreciate Pacquiao more. If you think defense and the shoulder roll, the art of hit and not get hit is more important, then you're gonna go with Floyd Mayweather. If you think, you know, being intelligent about the business of boxing is important, you're gonna go with Mayweather. If you think it's important to just fight whoever's out there, you know, that's Pacquiao, right? Like, there's just comparisons, and they're just different fighters. That's why the fight was so big between Pacquiao and Floyd. But, you know, in my opinion, I'm going to go with Pacquiao all day because I'm all about, you know, that. I got that Kobe mentality where I'm like, I want to see fighters take risk. And I think Pacquiao always had that. That's why I always say, like, LeBron is like Kobe, and that, you know, LeBron is like Mayweather, and then Kobe is like Pacquiao. Because, you know, even though people say on paper LeBron is better than Kobe, you know, everybody appreciates what Kobe, you know, was willing to do. He was willing to take all the risks, take all the shots, and then you have a guy like LeBron. Yeah, he had his moments of, you know, getting MVP, whatnot, getting these championships and all the accolades, the statistics of rebounds and assists as well. But people like accountability. They want to see you put yourself in dangerous positions, which isn't easy either. And I think that's what Pacquiao did. So, you know, I got to go with Pacquiao over Floyd, but that's just my opinion. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. But thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.